Hello and welcome to another episode of the Jim Powell Report. I'm your host, Jim Powell, and today I'm interviewing at the home of Alan Dershowitz here on Martha's Vineyard Island. And it's really a great opportunity, and thankful very much to have this chance to speak with you today because there's so much going on in Israel.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a very difficult time in Israel. I just got back from there. I was there for several weeks in the end of June, and I was the first person to be allowed into one of the tunnels that Israel had discovered. And they only discovered it because a Bedouin, a tracker, saw an air hole coming from deep in the earth. And this tunnel was 80 or 90 feet down under the earth. And we were allowed into it. It was not easy to get into, but once you were in there, it was about 6 foot high and about 3 or 4 feet wide, and it could send killer squads in. And we were told that the goal was on the Jewish New Year, when everybody is at prayer and in synagogues and at home, they were going to have hundreds of Hamas killers come up through the tunnels and massacre as many Israelis as possible. And so it was absolutely essential to destroy these tunnels. Imagine if there were tunnels coming under your home. They also had tunnels where the Israelis found dynamite right under kindergartens. And it would have been used to blow up the kindergartens and kill every child in the kindergarten. So when you see pictures of dead Palestinian children, you have to keep in your mind the number of dead Israeli children that would have resulted had these plots been allowed to carry out, or the number of dead children that would have resulted in Israel had Iron Dome not stopped the rockets and had the shelters not been built to protect Israelis. Hamas, on the other hand, builds shelters, but only allows their terrorists to go into them. It will not allow a single civilian to go into a shelter. And Hamas purposely picks the densest areas to fire from. Now, you've heard the myth that Gaza is the densest area in the world. It's not. It's not even as, it's 10 times less dense than Manhattan. It's far, far less dense than most major cities. And many of the areas outside of the cities are open fields. And Hamas could easily fire from open fields, build rockets, build tunnels from empty fields. But then there would be no civilian casualties. Hamas wants civilian casualties. That's their strategy.
That's part of their strategy, and then when those persons are injured, then they get the cameras out, right, and they're trying to attract the world sympathy.
Right.
And so, anyways,
and they do, and they succeed.
Yeah.
It does attract world sympathy. The media carries the pictures of the dead children. The UN gets all upset. The international community says there are going to be war crime trials. But what would America do? What would you do? Amos Oz, who's a great peace lover, started an interview the other day in which he asked the interviewer, he said, if your neighbor put his child on his lap and started shooting into the nursery in which your children are sleeping, and the only way to stop him from killing your children would be to fire back, try to avoid hitting the child, but knowing that you might hit the child, would you do it? Israel is put to that choice every single day, and it's put to the choice by Hamas.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people need to know who Hamas is. Could you give us a primer?
I wish people knew who Hamas was.
Hamas
was founded by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party back in 1928. Hamas worked with the founder, that is, the Muslim Brotherhood worked with the Nazi Party, helped to elect Hitler in Germany. Then they formed a brigade that fought in the Second World War, killing Jews and gypsies and gays and Slavs and other people, and they were declared to be a criminal organization at Nuremberg. Then the Muslim Brotherhood, which is Hamas, helped to rescue Nazi war criminals and to harbor them in Egypt and other places. And Hamas is an outgrowth. Its charter blames all the problems of the world, from the revolution in France to the drug trade, on Jews, and says that Hamas is waiting for the opportunity, this is in the charter, to kill every Jew hiding behind a rock and to fulfill the mandate of Islam. Now, of course, that's not what Islam wants. It's what Hamas wants. And so it's a criminal organization. It's like the mafia, except much stronger.
Mm-hmm. They're the bullies on the block, and everyone else is...
Well, they're worse than bullies. Bullies just push and shove. These people slaughter innocents. You know what they did recently? The most appalling thing. You know, they love to show pictures of dead babies. So they showed a picture of a slaughtered family, a family that had been murdered in cold blood, and they put on their web that this is what Israel did. The problem is it was a picture of a family of Israelis who had been murdered by Hamas people. And by Palestinians on the West Bank. And so they even use pictures of dead Israeli children to convey the impression that Israel kills and murders Palestinian children. Of course, Israel tries desperately to avoid casualties. They send notices in advance, they make phone calls, they knock on the roof, they do everything.
Leaflets from the air.
Leaflets. But
So it's part of Hamas's disinformation campaign. And so part of our purpose here today is to help educate people here that there really is there are different types of war, psychological war as well as real military war.
Media war.
And the media war.
The other myth you hear is that, I just heard it literally on television tonight on CNN, that the vast majority of people killed by Israel during this war have been women and children. Totally false. Totally false. The vast majority have been men between the ages of 15 and 40. They have been killed in vast overproportion to the number of men between 15 and 40 in the population, which proves that most of them are combatants. I mean, that's the age of combatants, men between 15 and 40. Very few women and children, proportional to the population, have actually been killed. Every death is a tragedy, but every death is the fault of Hamas for using these people as human shields.
And I understand that Hamas and Egypt and Turkey, they've been trying to get together, and that Hamas has been turning down the peace proposals.
Right. Hamas is the only country that loses a war and demands total surrender. Israel wins the war and is willing to negotiate, but Hamas demands total surrender, and they're not going to get it. Hamas has a choice. They can either demilitarize or they can have an end to the blockade. They can't have both. They can't have an end to the blockade and use the end of the blockade to bring in rockets and to build more tunnels. No country would allow that.
And for our viewers, we'd like to just drop in a map so people can see where the Gaza Strip, where this is all focused.
Well, Gaza Strip is about the same size as Martha's Vineyard. It's slightly bigger, about 15 to 20% bigger. It's 25 miles. Martha's Vineyard is around 23 miles by about 9 miles. The difference is Martha's Vineyard goes in and out, and Gaza is straight. So there's about 15 to 20%, maybe more square footage in Gaza. But it gives you a sense of the island. And there are 4 major population centers in the Gaza Strip, but a lot of empty areas in between those centers that could be used to fire rockets. But Hamas knows that if they use those areas to fire rockets, Israel will respond and wouldn't kill civilians. And they would lose the public relations war, and the media wouldn't have anything to report on. And so the media is largely at fault for encouraging Hamas to do this every other year. This has now been an every other year.
It's cyclical.
Yeah, and it's a tragedy because most of the losses are Hamas. Israel lost almost 70 soldiers in an effort to protect thousands of Israeli civilians from the tunnels and from the rockets.
I'm thinking of our own Homeland Security Department. They're working tirelessly to try to prevent any terrorist act in the United States. And the Israeli Defense Forces are working hard to try to prevent more deaths by going after Hamas.
Sure, the difference between
They're
Hamas,
responsible to do it, too.
Right. The difference between Hamas and Israel is, in Israel, the soldiers are used to protect the civilians. With Hamas, the civilians are used to protect the soldiers. And they use civilians to protect the soldiers. They would never fire from an open area. They would never take on Israel in a real battle. They have to operate from within the densest, most crowded areas. They purposely pick areas near the UN buildings, near hospitals. There are videotapes now of tunnels, killer tunnels, under mosques, and they use the mosques to protect them. Their battle stations are in the basements of hospitals. And Iran is doing the same thing. They're hiding some of their nuclear programs under hospitals, under schools, in order to put any government to the choice: if you want to destroy Iran's nuclear reactor, you're going to have to kill civilians.
And that's part of their strategy.
It is.
It's written into their charter. And it's hard for us in America, where we're so comfortable. We believe in the letter of the law. We execute it. We're involved with, listening to both sides. No one's a criminal until they're proven guilty.
But think about the United States, where we had 3,000 people killed on 9/11. President Clinton says he had a chance perhaps to prevent that by killing bin Laden. But he couldn't kill bin Laden without killing a number of civilians. I think a lot of Americans might ask themselves, maybe it was worth it. If we could have stopped 3,000 American civilians from being killed by killing bin Laden and some civilians in the process, maybe that's a trade-off that's worth it. These are the kinds of moral questions that have to be debated. They're debated endlessly in Israel. They're debated in my classes. There's no perfect answer to any of these questions. But to condemn Israel for making the choice to defend its own civilians, to try to prevent a 9/11, very hard to fault them for that.
Yes, and at Harvard with your classes, you've had an opportunity to speak on a lot of different legal issues, and you've written many books. You've written many, you mentioned 21
op-eds during
just
this
recently?
war. Yeah.
Holy cow.
I've written
Tell
one
me,
a day, basically.
Wow.
Yeah.
And tell me a little bit about things that have been standing out that you want our viewers to know about.
Well, I've been writing about every aspect of this crisis, but I write about a lot of subjects. I write about freedom of speech. I write about the First Amendment. In my new book, Taking the Stand, My Life and the Law, I have a chapter on all the homicide cases I've had. I've had 38 homicide cases, and I've won most of them. And I've had many free speech cases, most recently WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And I've had a lot of freedom of religion cases and cases involving racial issues. So, I've had an interesting career. Now most of my cases are transnational. I'm representing people who have cases that go all over the world. I represented the former president of the Ukraine, the former prime minister of Pakistan, the former prime minister of Israel. And so I have a lot of cases in the transnational sphere, people who are wanted in one country for crimes in another country. Right now I'm working on the ferry disaster in South Korea that killed 300 people. So a lot of the big cases come my way.
Mm-hmm. That's good. And I know some of the notable people of the world have had you in their homes or into their offices, whatever. You've recently had an interview. You were invited one-on-one with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah. Well, I've known Bibi since he's 23 years old. I met him in 1973. He was a student at MIT. I was teaching at Harvard. And we've become close friends. So every time I go to Israel, I meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I've known him when he was just a student. I've known him when he was the ambassador to the United Nations. I knew him when he was in the Knesset. I knew him the first time he was Prime Minister. I have a funny story about him. The first time he was Prime Minister was right after the O.J. Simpson case. And he calls me into the office and he says, "Alan, this is the most secure office. There are no wiretaps. You have to tell me, did O.J. do it?" And I thought he was going to ask me about I said, "Mr. Prime Minister, does Israel have nuclear weapons?" He said, "I can't tell you that." And I said, "I can't tell you that." A lawyer can never disclose client confidences.
That's how it works.
Yeah.
That's how it works.
Yeah.
Well, it's amazing that you have been very involved and you've grown from the point of earlier in your life, and with this autobiography, Taking the Stand, readers will get to know a personal side.
And they'll be very surprised. I was a terrible high school student. I had a 68 average. I was a good athlete. I was on the varsity basketball team, and I was not a starter. In my junior year, I was like on the 7th or 8th person on the bench. I'd come in. But I was supposed to be the starting point guard in my senior year, but I was suspended for academic deficiencies.
Oh, no.
So that's that's in 1955. I'm not even smart enough to make the basketball team at a mediocre high school. And by 1963, I'm offered an assistant professorship at the most prestigious law school in the world. So I try to tell the story in this book about those 8 years. What happened between the time I was a bum and the time I became a really good student?
What did happen?
You have to read the book. It's very hard to summarize that, but it was a major transition.
Well, that's great. We're going to include that in our reading this summer here on the Vineyard. And so with the many books, the plethora of books that you've written, from Taking the Stand, Stand for Peace, and all these different things, I've personally realized how important you have balanced your roots of law in ancient law, in the Torah, and the Talmud, and the Quran, and that you really look at both sides, and then you look for what is justice. And so I think our viewers need to realize that as you approach the issue of how Hamas and Israel are fighting it out, that there are different, the dichotomies are that you have to really understand the basis for judgment.
Oh, of course.
When you look at Israel and then you look at Hamas, Would you elaborate?
You always have to see both sides of every issue. Harry Truman called in his chief of staff once and said, "I want a lawyer who's been in an accident and lost one of his arms." They said, "What do you mean? Why?" He says, "I'm sick and tired of these lawyers who come in and say on the one hand, on the other hand. I want a lawyer with one hand who can just tell me what to do." Well, I'm not that lawyer. Whenever I counsel clients, I always say on the one hand, on the other hand. I always make it clear that there are choices, there are options. It's rarely black and white. It's mostly gray.
And when I've read some of your other books, Taking a Stand for Israel, you explained the development since 1947, 1928, I think, and onwards. Every few years there have been different proposals for apportioning territory of Israel.
And Israel has always accepted the two-state solution. In 1937, in 1948, in 1967, in 2001, in 2008, they've always said 2 states for 2 people, and the Palestinians have always rejected it. And I hope maybe the time has come where both sides will sit down and agree that there has to be a 2-state solution. It'd be best for the Palestinians, best for Israel. Israel needs peaceful neighbors. The Palestinians need security. They need, Israel needs security. They need peace. It's possible. It's doable.
It is. And it'd be a great opportunity because Israel leads the world in innovation in many of the companies. You know, Microsoft is over there and a lot of companies that we hear about every day.
But I invest myself in some companies that are joint Israel-Palestinian startups. I think it's a great idea for Israelis to work with Palestinians to create innovation. The Palestinians that I've met are very innovative. If there is peace, Israel and Palestine together, their scientists working together, doctors working together, could become a really important part of the world. And the peace dividend would be incredible for the Palestinians, for the Israelis, and for the rest of the world.
And the Palestinians cooperating would also see the benefits, and that's where they could go if they would buy into it and cooperate. But it seems to me, as I've read the apportionment of territories and where the boundary lines have been driven.
It's doable, though. It's doable. And right now, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, all want to see Hamas destroyed. They all are afraid of ISIS. They're afraid of Islamic radicalism. They all want to be moderate states, and Israel is the model for them. And it's possible that a new alliance might be emerging now between those moderate countries and Israel. And the tragedy is that Qatar, which was a moderate country at one point, and Turkey, which was a moderate country, have now become the strongest supporters of Hamas.
And when I think of the territory, just so our viewers can think of, you were talking about the Gaza Strip is about the size of Martha's Vineyard, a little bit.
And Israel's the size of New Jersey.
Yeah, and which is, you know,
not our biggest state. Not our biggest state.
And they're surrounded by the Arab world, which is 550 times the size of Israel's landmass. And so when people realize, here's this country that just wants to exist, and I'd like to go back to well, where did they get their start? Well, remember that after World War II, the United Nations said, hey, we can't keep having genocide. We can't do that. So Israel needs to have a homeland.
With two states. They divided what was the mandate, the British mandate, into 3 areas, basically. Transjordan, the largest part, which became a Jordanian state. It is now largely a Palestinian state. Then the West Bank and the Gaza, which was supposed to be an Arab Palestinian state, and then tiny Israel. Israel accepted that division, even though many were against it, and all the Arab countries attacked them in a genocidal war. Israel lost 1% of its population, including many Holocaust survivors, in that war of survival. They won the war, and they established themselves as a vibrant state. But they have been at war basically since that day, and they haven't had moments of peace at all. And the time has come, I think, for the Palestinians to understand that the refugee problem was a joint refugee problem. Refugees were created among the Palestinians, and the equal number of refugees were created among Jews of the Middle East and North Africa. Israel settled its refugees. The Arab states refused to settle the Palestinian refugees, and the time has come for that issue to be resolved as well. And it's all doable, but it needs the will to make peace.
Yes, and I remember watching the documentary that you had your hand in, Inside Israel with the came out on PBS 2
Right,
years ago,
right.
and you really explain that thesis very well and show lots of examples that it is doable.
It is doable
and could be done.
Yeah.
Well,
we hope maybe when you interview me next year, we'll be celebrating peace and maybe a two-state solution. That would be a very good result.
Well, let's. I wish you very well. Pray
Thank
for you
you.
to do so.
Thank you.
And with all your meetings with different people, and I look forward to reading your book, Taking the Stand: My Life in the Law. And
you can get it on Kindle. You can get it on Amazon. And one thing I guarantee you, you won't be bored.
okay, well, probably won't be. That's great. I never have been to any of your books. Well, Alan, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
For
thank you
being
so
here
much
today, and for your time. And best wishes as you go out into the world.
Thanks. I've enjoyed the interview. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to my viewers for watching this episode of the Jim Powell Report. We've been interviewing Alan Dershowitz here at his home on Martha's Vineyard, and we'll see you real soon.